The mountain shuddered before anyone realized the dragon had breathed. But the only person who looked toward the northern peaks was the quiet Omega. Everyone else had forgotten. Vivian Whitaker stopped in the middle of the great hall, a silver serving tray balanced carefully in her hands as a deep, distant vibration rolled beneath the polished marble floor. The crystal goblets trembled. Candle flames flickered. Then everything became still again. Around her, conversations resumed almost instantly. Noble alphas laughed over hunting stories. Betas traded military reports, and elegant ladies admired jeweled gowns beneath towering chandeliers carved from ancient antlers. No one seemed to notice the silence that followed the mountain's breath. Vivian noticed. She always noticed the things other people dismissed. At 23, she had learned there was little value in speaking first. An Omega with no reputation for strength was expected to be useful, polite, and invisible. She had become all three. Her simple cream-colored dress blended with the palace servants. Her long chestnut hair was pinned neatly behind her shoulders. Her gray-blue eyes rarely lifted above another person's chin because experience had taught her that meeting the gaze of powerful wolves often invited humiliation instead of kindness. Only one thing refused to disappear, no matter how quietly she lived: her heart. Miriam Whitaker had protected that heart all her life inside a weathered cottage at the edge of Blackridge territory. Every winter morning, her grandmother wrapped an old silver thread shawl around Vivian's shoulders before she left for the palace. People mistake gentleness for weakness, Miriam always said with a patient smile. Do not help them make that mistake about yourself. Vivian had never argued, although the world seemed determined to prove the opposite. As she crossed the hall, Beta Commander Damon Huxley intercepted her path without slowing his conversation. His shoulder clipped the edge of her tray just enough to send one goblet sliding dangerously close to the rim. Vivian caught it before it fell. Damon barely glanced back. Careful, he said with an amused smile. The palace has enough burdens without replacing broken silver because an Omega lost her balance. Several nearby officers chuckled. Vivian simply lowered her eyes. She had discovered long ago that quiet dignity lasted longer than wounded pride. Across the hall, Marissa Vale watched the exchange with polished elegance. Dressed in deep crimson velvet and surrounded by admiring nobles, she carried herself like someone already imagining a crown upon her head. As Vivian approached with fresh cups, Marissa stepped aside just enough to block her path. Some people, she said lightly for everyone nearby to hear, are born to stand beside a throne. Others are born to polish it. More laughter followed. Vivian offered no reply. She carefully walked around Marissa and continued serving guests, refusing to surrender the small piece she had fought so hard to protect within herself. Then the great bronze doors opened. Every conversation ended. King Ronan Blackridge entered without escort, dressed entirely in black except for the silver clasp fastened beneath his collar. He did not announce himself. He never needed to. His presence alone changed the room. Warriors straightened instinctively. Nobles lowered their heads. Even Damon stepped back. Vivian did the same, keeping her eyes lowered as protocol demanded, yet she could still sense the quiet authority surrounding the Alpha King like winter itself. Stories described him as ruthless, impossible to deceive, and fiercely devoted to the ancient guardian who had stood beside every Blackridge ruler for generations. Vivian had never spoken to him. She doubted he even knew she existed. Then the mountain breathed again. This time the vibration lasted longer. A crystal chandelier chimed softly overhead. Ronan lifted his head toward the northern windows before anyone else reacted, and Vivian felt an inexplicable ache tighten inside her chest. It came without warning, sharp enough to steal her breath. Not pain, sorrow. Somewhere far beyond the palace walls, something proud, ancient, and terribly alone seemed to be calling through the earth itself. Vivian's fingers instinctively closed around the edge of Miriam's silver thread shawl. The feeling vanished almost immediately, leaving only confusion behind. Before she could gather herself, the palace doors burst open once more. A rain-soaked border scout stumbled inside, breathing hard after what looked like miles of desperate riding. He dropped to one knee before the throne. "Your Majesty," he said, struggling for air. Oral has disappeared near Obsidian Hollow. The entire hall froze. Even the boldest warriors fell silent at the name of the ancient dragon's mountain. Ronan's face revealed almost nothing, yet the room somehow grew colder. "When?" he asked. "Just before dawn," the scout answered. His trail ends at the Sleeping Hollow. Fear spread quietly through the gathering. No one volunteered to speak. No one volunteered to move. Vivian felt the invisible ache return, stronger than before. This time it carried a single desperate impression that made tears sting unexpectedly behind her eyes. Someone was still alive. Someone was waiting. And every moment of hesitation mattered. The great hall emptied with startling speed, not in panic, but in disciplined urgency. Every officer and messenger moving toward the courtyard, while whispered orders echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling. Vivian remained where she was for a heartbeat longer, the faint cry still lingering inside her as though it had settled beneath her ribs instead of fading into the mountain. She watched King Ronan descend the stone steps without hesitation, Daemon Huxley already assembling riders around him, their armor catching the gray afternoon light. No one looked at Vivian. No one expected the quiet Omega to matter in a crisis meant for warriors. She slipped away unnoticed, her feet carrying her through familiar service passages until she reached the palace garden overlooking the northern cliffs. The wind smelled different there, carrying pine, rain, and something else she could not name. She closed her eyes, trying to convince herself the sound she had heard belonged to imagination. Instead, the cry returned, softer this time, followed by an overwhelming ache that tightened her chest. It did not sound like fear. It sounded like exhaustion, like someone who had fought for too long alone. Vivian wrapped Miriam's silver thread shawl tighter around her shoulders, remembering countless evenings beside the cottage fireplace when her grandmother had spoken of the oldest wolves. The oldest guardians do not always speak with voices, Miriam had once whispered. Sometimes they speak through compassion, because only those willing to listen without pride can hear them. Vivian had never fully understood those words. Until now. She hurried down the narrow path leading toward the stable yard, hoping only to reach the eastern overlook where she might hear the mountain more clearly, but a familiar voice stopped her. Running after heroes now. Marissa Vale leaned against a carved stone pillar, perfectly composed despite the alarm spreading across the palace. Be careful. Dangerous places are not made for gentle girls. Vivian lowered her eyes politely. I'm only going outside. Marissa smiled, though no warmth reached her face. Exactly where everyone else is trying not to send you. Before Vivian could answer, Daemon emerged from the courtyard, fastening leather gloves as soldiers prepared fresh horses nearby. His sharp gaze landed on Vivian immediately. The palace is restricted until further notice, he said. Return to the servants' wing. Vivian hesitated only long enough to ask quietly, has anyone actually seen Auril? Daemon frowned. That is not your concern. What if he is still alive? She asked. What if he is waiting? Several nearby soldiers exchanged puzzled glances. Daemon folded his arms. The great wolf has survived battles before you were born. If anyone can endure, it is him. Leave this to those capable of protecting the kingdom. Vivian nodded because arguing would accomplish nothing, but the cry pulsed again, stronger than before, stealing the air from her lungs. Without another word, she turned away, though not toward the servants' quarters. She followed the outer garden path until the palace walls disappeared behind towering pines. Rain dripped steadily from the branches, soaking the forest floor, while distant thunder rolled above the mountains. After nearly half a mile, she reached an overlook where the eastern ridges stretched into dark cliffs. There, the sound finally became unmistakable. It was not carried by the wind. It was carried through her heart. She dropped to one knee, one hand against the wet earth. Images she could not explain flickered across her mind. Massive white fur streaked with blood. Broken stone. Black scales reflecting dim firelight. A cavern glowing beneath an enormous sleeping shape. Then silence. Vivian gasped and opened her eyes. The vision vanished as quickly as it had appeared, yet one certainty remained. Auril was alive. Barely. And he was trapped somewhere close to Obsidian Hollow. Footsteps approached from behind. She turned to find King Ronan standing several yards away, having come alone without escort. His expression remained unreadable, but his silver eyes searched hers with quiet intensity. You left the palace after I ordered everyone to remain inside, he said evenly. Vivian rose, rain clinging to loose strands of chestnut hair. Forgive me, Your Majesty. Ronan studied her for a long moment before asking the question no one else would have considered. Why were you looking toward the eastern ridge before any scout returned with another report? Vivian swallowed. She knew how impossible the truth would sound. Because Her fingers tightened around the edge of Miriam's shawl. I think Oral is calling for help, and I think he is running out of time. King Ronan did not laugh. That was the first thing Vivian noticed, and somehow it frightened her more than if he had dismissed her outright. He stood beneath the rain-dark pines, still as carved stone, his silver eyes fixed on her, as if he were weighing not her rank, but the tremor in her voice. For most of her life, people had heard Vivian speak and decided she was too soft to know anything worth knowing. Ronan listened. "Tell me exactly what you heard," he said. Vivian drew a careful breath. "Not words. Pain. A pull toward the mountain. I saw white fur, black stone, and something enormous sleeping over him." A muscle tightened in Ronan's jaw. Vordhak. The name seemed to dim the forest around them. Before Vivian could ask how he knew, hooves thundered from the palace road. Damon Huxley arrived with 6 riders, rain flashing off their armor, irritation already hardening his face. "Your Majesty, we have the Eastern Trail secured." His eyes shifted to Vivian. "And she should not be here." Ronan did not look away from her. "She may know where Oral is." The soldiers fell silent. Damon gave a short, humorless breath. "An Omega's feelings are not a rescue plan." Vivian lowered her gaze, but the sting landed. Ronan turned then, and the coldness in his expression made Damon straighten. "Neither is pride, Commander. Yet you seem prepared to ride into a dragon's hollow carrying plenty of it." Damon's face colored, but he bowed. "Then allow me to prove action is still worth more than whispers." Within minutes, they were moving east through the forest, Ronan on foot by choice, Damon leading the riders. Vivian kept between 2 guards as though she were both witness and burden. The closer they came to Obsidian Hollow, the quieter the world became. Birds vanished from the branches. The rain turned warm before it touched the ground. Steam curled from cracks in the stone path. Vivian's shawl, damp only moments before, began to dry against her shoulders, its silver threads catching faint light, though there was no sun. Ronan noticed. He did not comment. At the mouth of the lower ravine, the scouts found the first sign, a massive paw print pressed deep into mud turned hard by heat. Beside it lay strands of white gold fur clinging to jagged rock. Ronan knelt and touched them with 2 fingers. His face did not change, but Vivian felt the grief move through him like a door closing somewhere deep. Oral was not simply an animal to him, not a symbol. He was family. Damon signaled 2 riders forward. "We go in, cut whatever holds him, and retreat before the beast shifts in sleep." "No steel near the cavern floor," Ronan warned. "The echo may wake Vordhak." Damon's mouth tightened. "Then we use hooks and rope." Vivian heard the cry again, sharper now, and turned toward a narrow break in the rocks half hidden by steam. "Not that way," she whispered. Damon ignored her. The first rider stepped onto the main shelf. A dull crack sounded beneath his boot. Not loud, but the ravine answered with a low vibration that passed through bone. Far inside the mountain, something exhaled. Heat rolled outward. The horses screamed and reared. Damon cursed, grabbing one bridle as sparks drifted from the cavern mouth like fireflies. Ronan lifted one hand, and every soldier froze. For several seconds, no one breathed. Then, from within the hollow, came Oral's faint cry. This time, everyone heard it. Vivian pressed a hand to her chest. Damon stared at the dark entrance, all certainty drained from his face. "He is under the sleeping chamber," one scout whispered. "There is no path wide enough for a team." Ronan's voice was quiet. "There must be." The scout shook his head, pale with dread. "Only the old seam in the upper wall, maybe 2 feet across. A child could crawl through. Not an armored wolf." The words settled like a sentence. Damon looked at Vivian then, unwilling and angry, because for the first time her smallness was not weakness. It was possibility. Ronan turned slowly toward her, and Vivian saw the battle in his eyes. A king needing a miracle, a man refusing to ask a gentle girl to walk toward death. But beneath the mountain, Oral cried again, weaker than before, and Vivian already knew the choice forming in her heart. For several long seconds, no one spoke. The only sound inside the ravine was the slow pulse of heat rising from Obsidian Hollow and Oral's weakening cry drifting through the stone. Vivian could almost feel it slipping farther away, like a heartbeat fading into fog. She looked toward the narrow crack hidden high along the cavern wall, then back at the warriors gathered below. They were stronger than she would ever be, better trained, better armed. Yet every one of them was trapped by the same impossible truth. None of them could fit through the only passage that led to the Great Wolf. There has to be another way, Damon Huxley said sharply, refusing to accept what the scouts had discovered. He pointed toward the main entrance. We bring ropes. Hooks. We cut a larger opening. One of the older scouts slowly shook his head. The rock above that chamber is older than the kingdom itself. Strike it once, and the vibration could wake Vorthak before anyone reaches Oral. Damon clenched his jaw. Then we wait until the dragon leaves. The scout's face fell. Ancient dragons sleep for weeks, sometimes months. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. Oral does not have months. Silence settled again. Vivian closed her eyes. The invisible pull inside her chest had become almost unbearable now. It no longer felt like distant sorrow. It felt like someone trying with the last of his strength not to disappear. Before fear could convince her otherwise, she stepped forward. I will go. Every head turned. Damon stared as though he had misheard her. Then he laughed once, a short, disbelieving sound. You? Vivian nodded. The passage is small enough. Exactly, Damon replied. Small enough for an Omega who has never seen battle to crawl directly beneath an ancient dragon. Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably. No one joined his laughter this time. They had all heard Oral. They all knew time was running out. Ronan remained silent. His silver eyes never left Vivian's face. Why? He finally asked. It was not a challenge. It was an honest question. Vivian searched for an answer worthy of the moment, but only the truth came. Because he is alone. The words hung in the cold mountain air. Everyone here loves him because he guards the throne, she continued quietly. I want to help him because he is suffering. Something changed in the faces around her. Even Damon looked away for a moment. Ronan took several slow steps toward Vivian until only a few feet separated them. Do you understand what waits inside? He asked. A dragon whose breath can melt steel. One unexpected sound. One frightened movement. One mistake. Vivian nodded. I understand enough to be afraid. Then why are you still standing here? She looked toward the hidden seam in the rock. Because being afraid is not the worst thing that can happen today. Ronan followed her gaze. For the first time since leaving the palace, the mask of the Alpha King slipped. Vivian saw the exhaustion beneath it, the helplessness of someone who could command armies but could not order fate to spare the one companion who had stood beside him since childhood. I cannot ask this of you, he said softly. You are not asking, Vivian answered. I am choosing. Another deep tremor rolled beneath their feet. Steam burst from cracks in the stone, carrying a wave of suffocating heat through the ravine. Above the hidden passage, several loose rocks tumbled into darkness. Somewhere inside the mountain, Oral cried again. This time the sound was so weak it almost disappeared before reaching them. Vivian did not wait for permission. She untied Miriam Whitaker's silver thread shawl from around her shoulders and carefully wrapped it over her arms and back, remembering how her grandmother had always insisted the old cloth should never be discarded, no matter how worn it became. As the final folds settled into place, the silver threads shimmered faintly beneath the rising heat. Ronan noticed immediately. His expression sharpened. Where did your grandmother find that shawl? Vivian shook her head. She only told me it belonged to our family for generations. Ronan reached out slowly and touched one corner of the fabric. The silver threads glowed brighter beneath his fingertips before fading again. He withdrew his hand almost reverently. This cloth was woven to endure dragon fire. He murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Damon stared in disbelief. That cannot be possible. Neither is anything that has happened today, Ronan replied without looking away from Vivian. He removed the leather guard from his own left forearm and fastened it carefully around her wrist. This belonged to every Blackridge king before me. Bring it back. Vivian looked into his silver eyes and understood what he could not bring himself to say. He was not asking her to save his kingdom. He was asking her to come home alive. She offered the smallest smile, turned toward the narrow crack in the mountain, lowered herself onto the stone, and began crawling into the darkness while every warrior in the ravine stood silently aside. The crack in the mountain narrowed until Vivian could no longer turn her head. Stone pressed against her shoulders, scraping Ronan's leather guard each time she pulled herself forward another inch. The deeper she crawled, the hotter the air became. Every breath tasted of smoke and ancient minerals, drying her throat until swallowing hurt. Behind her, the faint gray daylight disappeared. Ahead, only a dull crimson glow waited, pulsing gently like the heartbeat of something impossibly old. She forced herself to move slowly. Miriam had always said that fear rushed people into mistakes, while love taught them patience. Vivian repeated those words silently, with every careful breath. One hand, one knee, one heartbeat. At last the passage widened enough for her to lift her head. She looked down into the chamber beneath Obsidian Hollow, and every thought inside her mind fell silent. Vorthak filled the cavern like a mountain given life. His black scales overlapped in enormous ridges, each one reflecting rivers of molten gold flowing beneath their surface. Every slow breath lifted his vast body several inches before settling again with a sound like distant thunder. Smoke drifted lazily from his nostrils, curling across the floor in warm ribbons. Beyond that sleeping giant, nearly hidden beneath a collapsed stone pillar, lay Auril. The great wolf was barely visible through the haze, his magnificent white gold coat stained with soot, one foreleg trapped beneath a chain of black stone that seemed to have grown directly from the mountain itself. His breathing was shallow. His eyes remained closed. Vivian searched desperately for another path. There was none. The only way across the chamber was over the dragon himself. Her pulse hammered so loudly she feared it would echo through the cavern. She almost turned back. For one terrible moment she imagined returning to Ronan, telling him no living soul could survive what waited ahead. He would understand. No one would blame her. Then Auril stirred. One golden eye opened just enough to find the tiny figure watching from the rocks above. There was no panic in that ancient gaze. No plea. Only quiet resignation, as though he had already accepted dying alone if it meant the dragon remained asleep. Something inside Vivian refused to accept the same ending. She eased herself from the narrow ledge and lowered both hands onto the nearest ridge of Vorthak's back. The heat struck immediately. Even through Miriam's silver thread shawl, it felt like touching sun-warmed iron in midsummer. The fabric shimmered softly, its woven threads glowing with pale moonlight as they absorbed the worst of the dragon's ancient fire. Vivian released a trembling breath she had not realized she was holding. Miriam had known. Somehow, generations before this day, someone in the Whitaker family had prepared for exactly this kind of moment. Vivian flattened herself against the dragon's immense body. She did not crawl quickly. She scarcely crawled at all. Every movement was measured against Vorthak's breathing. When the dragon inhaled, his body slowly rose beneath her, carrying her upward. Vivian froze completely, fingers gripping the edges of his great scales without making a sound. When he exhaled, she slid forward only a few inches before becoming still once more. It was less like crossing a creature than learning the rhythm of an ocean. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Sweat soaked her hair despite the cooling shimmer of the shawl. Her arms trembled from supporting her own weight. Once, her knee slipped between two enormous scales, and a sharp click echoed through the chamber. Vorthak's breathing stopped. The silence became unbearable. Vivian closed her eyes. Somewhere beyond the mountain, she imagined Ronan waiting helplessly, unable to protect either of them. Slowly, painfully slowly, the dragon released another breath. The mountain seemed to exhale with him. Vivian almost collapsed from relief. She continued, inch by inch, until she finally reached the last curve of Vorthak's sleeping body. Only a few feet separated her from Auril now. She stretched out one shaking hand toward the great wolf. His eye opened wider. The moment their fingertips and fur met, a warmth unlike the dragon's fire flowed quietly through her heart. It was not magic. It felt older than magic. It felt like recognition. Auril lifted his heavy head just enough to brush his muzzle against Vivian's trembling hand, and in that silent gesture, she understood something no one had ever told her. She had not crossed the dragon because she was fearless. She had crossed because kindness had always been stronger than fear. Behind her, deep within the vast chest beneath her footprints, Vorthak's sleeping breath changed, becoming slower, heavier, and just a little less asleep. Vivian reached Auril as the dragon's eyelid quivered beneath a thin veil of ash. She did not have time to be relieved. Up close, the great wolf seemed impossibly old, his white gold fur carrying the faint scent of snow, sunlight, and battlefield smoke. A black stone chain wrapped around one massive foreleg, not iron, not rope, but living rock that pulsed with the same ember glow beneath Vorthak's scales. Auril watched her with one open eye, and the pain inside it was no longer only fear. It was warning. Vivian placed her hand against the chain. Heat shot up her arm, and Ronan's leather guard flashed silver, shielding her skin from the worst of it. For one breath, she saw something that was not the chamber. A woman with Miriam's gray eyes standing years ago beneath this same mountain, weaving silver thread while a young white wolf slept at her feet. Then the vision vanished. Vivian understood only a piece of it, but it was enough. Her grandmother had not merely owned the shawl. She had known Aurel. Maybe she had once protected him too. "Help me," Vivian whispered, unsure whether she spoke to the wolf, the shawl, or the hidden strength Miriam had left behind. The silver thread tied around the dragon's scale tightened at her wrist, glowing brighter. Aurel lowered his muzzle and breathed softly over the chain. The black stone cracked, not breaking, but weakening. Vivian braced Ronan's guard against the rock and pulled. Pain tore through her shoulders. The chain resisted like a living thing, tightening around Aurel's leg until he made a faint sound that nearly broke her resolve. "I am sorry," she breathed, and pulled again. Above them, Vorthak's breath stopped. The silence was worse than the heat. Vivian froze, cheek pressed against Aurel's fur. A deep rumble rolled through the dragon's chest. One enormous claw shifted. Pebbles fell from the ceiling, striking the floor with tiny sounds that seemed unforgivably loud. Aurel moved then, not away from danger, but toward her, covering her small body with the edge of his neck as if the creature she had come to save was trying to shield her instead. The gesture filled Vivian with a grief so tender it became strength. She wrapped both hands around the fractured chain, pressed her forehead to it, and thought of every quiet kindness the world had mocked because it did not look like power. The shawl blazed moonwhite. The chain split with a muted crack. Aurel's leg came free. He tried to rise and nearly collapsed, but Vivian pushed against his shoulder with everything she had. "Not yet," she whispered. "Please, not here." A narrow gap opened beyond the fallen pillar, a lower passage she had not seen before, half hidden by ash. It would not fit a standing wolf, but Aurel could crawl. Vivian guided him toward it, step by trembling step, while Vorthak's eyelid lifted a fraction behind them, revealing a slit of molten gold. Heat surged across the chamber. Vivian threw the shawl wide over Aurel's injured side, choosing without hesitation to leave her own arms exposed to the burning air. Aurel turned his head sharply, golden eye fixed on her, and in that gaze she felt a wordless truth pass between them. The Guardian had accepted her. Not as servant, not as accident, as someone bound to his life now by choice. Far above, a shout echoed through stone. Ronan's voice. "Vivian." She had no breath to answer. She shoved Aurel into the passage just as Vorthak exhaled, a rolling wave of firelight rather than flame, bright enough to turn the cavern white. The shawl absorbed the heat, its silver threads flaring, then dimming. Vivian stumbled after Aurel, her knees striking stone. Behind her, the dragon's eye opened wider. Ahead, Aurel dragged himself. The first sound Ronan heard was not the dragon. It was Aurel's voice, low and strained, echoing through the stone with a note he had never heard before. It was not a call for battle. It was a plea. The moment it reached the passage, Ronan and Damon forced their way through the widened crack the scouts had carved after Vivian disappeared inside. Jagged stone tore at their armor as they squeezed into the cavern, arriving just in time to witness a sight no king in Blackridge history had ever imagined. Vivian Whitaker stood alone before the awakened dragon. The silver thread shawl shimmered softly around her shoulders, torn and dusted with ash, while Aurel remained only a few feet behind her, finally free but refusing to retreat. The great wolf staggered toward the narrow exit before stopping once more. His injured leg trembled beneath him, yet his golden eyes never left Vivian. Damon reached for the Guardian's thick fur. "Come," he urged quietly. "You cannot help her if you fall here." Aurel did not move. Instead, he released another aching cry that filled the chamber with heartbreaking devotion. He would not abandon the woman who had crossed death itself to save him. Vivian turned just enough to meet his eyes. Though exhaustion weighed on every breath, a gentle smile found its way onto her soot-streaked face. "Please," she whispered. "You already kept your promise by surviving. Now let me keep mine." Aurel held her gaze for one long moment before slowly lowering his head. Only then did he allow Damon to guide him toward the safety of the passage, though he looked back after nearly every step. Ronan never followed. Every instinct as Alpha King demanded that he protect the kingdom's ancient guardian. Every instinct buried far deeper demanded that he run to Vivian's side. His muscles tensed, ready to cross the chamber despite the impossible danger. Before he could move, Vorthak's second eye slowly opened. Molten amber light spread across the cavern as the dragon raised his colossal head just enough to make the mountain groan beneath its own age. Heat rolled outward in slow waves, carrying centuries of lonely silence with it. Ronan instinctively stepped forward. The dragon's vast eye shifted immediately toward him. Stone beneath his boots cracked from the pressure of that ancient gaze alone. Vivian reached one trembling hand toward him without turning around. "Please," she said softly. "Trust me." Ronan stopped. He had commanded armies. He had faced rival alphas without hesitation. Yet obeying those two quiet words demanded more courage than drawing any sword. He lowered his hand, choosing faith instead of force. Vivian faced Vorthak once more. Up close, she could see that the dragon's eyes held no hunger, no rage, only an exhaustion so deep it seemed older than memory itself. Then the truth settled gently into her heart. Vorthak had never hunted Auril. As the mountain shifted through countless years of restless sleep, Livingstone had imprisoned the great wolf by accident. They had mistaken loneliness for cruelty because fear always preferred the simplest answer. Vivian slowly lowered both empty hands where the dragon could see them. "You have been protecting this mountain for longer than anyone remembers," she whispered. "And no one remembered to protect you." The dragon did not roar. He simply watched her. Hot breath drifted across the chamber, lifting loose strands of chestnut hair around her face and making the silver threads woven into Miriam's ancient shawl glow with quiet moonlight. The melody her grandmother had sung through countless winter nights rose naturally into Vivian's thoughts. She closed her eyes and began humming, so softly that it barely rose above the dragon's breathing. It was not magic. It was comfort. Auril answered first. Though weakened almost beyond standing, he lifted his head and released a long, gentle note that blended with Vivian's melody. The sound filled the cavern with something forgotten long before Blackridge had ever existed. Ronan felt his own wolf grow still inside him, not from submission, but from peace. One by one, every soldier lowered their weapons without being told. Even Damon removed his helmet in silent respect. Vorthak blinked once. Then again, the enormous dragon slowly lowered his head until one ancient eye rested level with Vivian. She did not flinch. She stepped forward one final pace and gently laid her soot-marked hand against the warm edge of a single obsidian scale. The glowing ember chain wrapped around her wrist crumbled quietly into ash. The dragon closed both eyes. His next breath flowed across the chamber like the ending of a storm, slow, deep, and utterly peaceful. The mountain itself seemed to relax. Only then did Vivian's strength finally leave her. Her knees gave way before she reached the ground. Ronan crossed the chamber in an instant, catching her before she fell against the black stone. Her hands were reddened by the dragon's heat despite the shawl's protection, and ash covered the sleeves of her torn dress. Yet her first whisper was not for herself. "Is Auril safe?" Ronan looked toward the passage. The great wolf had stopped once again. Ignoring the pain in his injured leg, Auril slowly returned, lowered himself before Vivian, and rested his great white gold forehead gently against her outstretched hand. No king had ever received such a gesture. No warrior had ever earned it. Damon bowed his head. Every scout followed. And as Ronan held Vivian close, he understood that Blackridge had not simply witnessed the rescue of its guardian. It had witnessed the return of the forgotten heart that had once united wolves, dragons, and people before fear taught them to live apart. No one left the chamber immediately. Even after Vorthak drifted back into peaceful sleep, the mountain seemed to hold its breath, as though every soul inside Obsidian Hollow feared that one careless sound might awaken the ancient dragon once more. Ronan knelt beside Vivian without a word, gently lifting her into his arms while Damon and the scouts quietly guided Auril toward the narrow passage. The great wolf resisted at first, refusing to move until Vivian's eyes opened long enough to offer him the faintest reassuring smile. "Go," she whispered, her voice barely stronger than a breath. "I am coming too." Only then did Auril reluctantly turn toward the exit. The climb out of the mountain took hours. The passage was too narrow for haste and too dangerous for mistakes. Scouts widened sections of the tunnel stone by stone, while healers waited near the entrance, their lanterns glowing against the fading darkness before dawn. Ronan never once placed Vivian on the ground. Though ash covered his cloak and soot darkened his hands, he carried her with the same careful tenderness from the cavern to the waiting camp beyond the ravine. Outside, the first cool mountain wind finally reached them, washing away the suffocating heat of the dragon's chamber. As dawn slowly painted the eastern sky with pale gold, the healers gathered around Vivian beneath the shelter of towering pines. They carefully treated the redness across her hands and arms where the dragon's heat had reached her despite the protection of Miriam's silver thread shawl. The ancient fabric itself no longer glowed brightly. Its silver threads shimmered only faintly now, as though generations of quiet purpose had finally been fulfilled. Miriam had preserved it all her life for a day she would never live to see. Nearby, Oral lay upon a bed of pine needles prepared by the scouts. His injured foreleg had been cleaned and wrapped, yet the enormous guardian refused to close his eyes. No matter how often the healers urged him to rest, his gaze remained fixed upon Vivian. Each time she stirred, one white ear lifted. Each time she breathed peacefully again, the tension slowly eased from his great shoulders. Ronan noticed everything. Long after the healers finished their work, he remained seated beside Vivian beneath the morning light, one hand resting quietly over hers without disturbing her sleep. He had spent years believing leadership meant carrying burdens no one else could bear. Watching the exhausted Omega beside him, he realized true strength sometimes looked like trusting someone whose courage came not from power, but from compassion. "The dragon was never our enemy," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. Damon, sitting nearby with his helmet resting on the ground beside him, nodded slowly. "Neither was fear," he answered after a long silence. "Only what fear convinced us to believe." Vivian opened her eyes just enough to hear them. Though exhaustion still lingered in every movement, her smile remained gentle. "Loneliness can look frightening from far away," she whispered. "Sometimes all it has been waiting for is kindness." Ronan looked toward the distant silhouette of Obsidian Hollow rising beyond the forest. Somewhere beneath those ancient cliffs, Vorthak slept peacefully for the first time in centuries. Not because he had been defeated, but because someone had finally understood him. As the sun climbed higher, word of Oral's survival spread through the waiting camps below the mountain. Warriors who had prepared themselves for mourning instead watched the great wolf slowly rise to his feet. Ignoring every voice around him, Oral crossed the clearing until he stood before Vivian. The forest became completely still. With quiet dignity, the ancient guardian lowered himself onto both front legs and gently rested his great white gold head across Vivian's lap. She smiled through tired eyes and stroked the thick fur between his ears. Around them, hardened soldiers removed their helmets one after another. No order had been given. Respect simply arrived on its own. Ronan understood the moment more deeply than anyone else. Blackridge would celebrate the rescue of its guardian for generations to come, but history would remember something even greater. A forgotten Omega had reminded an entire kingdom that the strongest bond was never forged through fear or dominance. It was earned through mercy freely given when no one expected anything in return. Looking toward the palace waiting beyond the mountains, Ronan quietly made a promise that needed no witness. When Vivian Whitaker walked through those gates again, she would never stand unnoticed at the edge of another room. From this day forward, Blackridge itself would rise to honor the woman who had restored the forgotten bond between its king, its guardian, and the ancient world they had all nearly lost. When the gates of Blackridge Hall opened beneath the golden light of a new morning, the kingdom expected to celebrate the return of its Alpha King and the great wolf who had guarded Blackridge for generations. No one expected the quiet Omega who had once crossed the hall carrying silver trays to return as the woman who had quietly changed its future. Everything inside the great hall appeared unchanged. The polished marble still reflected the towering windows. Ancient banners still hung proudly beneath carved antlers. Nobles still gathered beneath glittering chandeliers exactly as they had only days before. Yet the atmosphere no longer carried the quiet certainty that power belonged only to the strong. Vivian Whitaker entered beside King Ronan Blackridge. Her cream-colored dress, carefully repaired though faint traces of ash still remained along the sleeves. Miriam's silver thread shawl rested gently across her shoulders, no longer glowing with magic, but carrying something far more enduring, memory. Oral followed several steps behind them. Though his injured foreleg remained carefully bandaged, the great white gold guardian walked with calm dignity, his steady presence drawing silent respect from every person in the hall. Before anyone could speak, The royal archivist stepped forward carrying an ancient cedar chest recovered from the forgotten vaults beneath Blackridge Castle after Ronan had ordered every surviving record concerning Obsidian Hollow to be examined. Dust covered its iron hinges, and the oldest parchment inside had nearly crumbled with age. The archivist bowed deeply before the throne. "Your Majesty," he announced, "the records confirm what was believed lost." He carefully unfolded a faded scroll bearing the crest of House Whitaker woven beside the crest of Blackridge itself. Murmurs spread through the hall. Long before our kingdom was founded, the archivist continued, the Whitaker keepers served as guardians of the sacred peace between the Great Wolf, the Sleeping Dragon, and the first Alpha rulers. Their duty was never to command strength, but to preserve compassion whenever fear threatened to break that covenant. Ronan accepted the ancient document before turning toward Vivian. "Your grandmother protected more than a family heirloom," he said softly. "She protected the last living reminder of who we once were." Vivian lowered her eyes, emotion tightening her throat as she gently touched the familiar silver threads resting against her shoulders. Suddenly, countless childhood memories returned with new meaning. Miriam carefully repairing loose stitches beneath candlelight. Miriam refusing every offer to sell the worn shawl. Miriam smiling each winter morning while saying only, "Someday kindness will ask something difficult of you." She had never realized her grandmother had been preparing her for this moment her entire life. Ronan faced the assembled court. "For generations, Blackridge measured greatness by victories won in battle," he declared. "We forgot that our oldest oath was never to conquer. It was to protect." His gaze settled on Vivian with quiet pride. When every warrior stood helpless before fear, one gentle Omega remembered that promise. Damon Huxley stepped forward first. Before the entire court, the commander removed the silver wolf insignia from his cloak and placed it respectfully into Vivian's hands. "I once believed courage always arrived carrying a weapon," he admitted. "You showed me that sometimes it arrives carrying compassion instead." Vivian smiled gently before returning the insignia to him. "Then wear it," she said softly. "But let it remind every commander after you that the people who appear smallest are often protecting something no one else can see." Damon bowed lower than rank required. Marissa Vale approached next, her confident pride replaced by quiet honesty. "I spent too much of my life wanting to stand beside greatness," she confessed. "I never understood that greatness begins with how we treat those standing beside us." Vivian reached out and took her hand. "Then today is a good day to begin again." No resentment remained between them, only understanding. The hall grew silent once more as orals slowly crossed the polished floor. Every noble stepped aside without instruction. The ancient guardian stopped before Vivian, then gradually lowered himself until both front legs rested upon the marble. With extraordinary gentleness, he bowed his great white gold head and placed his forehead against the back of her bandaged hand. The royal archivist quietly closed his eyes. "It is written," he whispered, "that the great wolf bows only once each generation, and only to the keeper whose compassion restores the ancient covenant." No one doubted the truth now. Tears filled the eyes of soldiers who had survived countless battles. Even hardened nobles lowered their heads in reverence. Ronan looked at Vivian not with the gratitude of a king rewarding a subject, but with the admiration of a man whose life had been forever changed. He offered her his hand, not to elevate her above others, but to stand beside her as an equal. Vivian accepted with a quiet smile. Together they turned toward the great windows overlooking the northern mountains. Far beyond the palace walls, Obsidian Hollow rested peacefully beneath the morning sun. Deep within the mountain, Vorthax slept undisturbed, no longer feared as a monster but honored as an ancient guardian whose loneliness had finally been understood. Beside the throne, Oral resumed his watch as generations before him had done, yet whenever his golden eyes found Vivian, they carried the unmistakable warmth of family. And in the years that followed, children across Blackridge would hear many stories about the day an Alpha King reclaimed hope, the day the Great Wolf was saved, and the day an ancient dragon chose peace. But the story they cherished most was always the simplest one, that an ordinary young woman changed the destiny of an entire kingdom because she believed kindness was still worth choosing, even when no one else believed it could save the world.